Hello and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Stephen Saum, and I'm Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Jim Sciutto, Emmy Award-winning journalist and author of The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. Jim Sciutto serves as CNN's Chief National Security Correspondent and anchor of CNN Newsroom on Max. A well-respected journalist, he spent more than 2 decades covering historic events here and abroad. For his outstanding professional contributions, he's been recognized with several honors, including the Edward R. Murrow Award, the George Polk Award, and the Merriman Smith Award for Excellence in Presidential Coverage. Jim Sciutto, welcome back. It's good to see you here at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs program once again.
Thanks for having me. I kind of wish I was out there with you in person. I'd love to come to the West Coast. I guess it's been 5 years ago when I did this event last, but it's nice, second best virtually, to be virtually present with you.
Well, we're excited to have the opportunity to talk to you right as your new book has been released, and I'd like to start off by diving into one of the moments that really seems like it led to the book, when you remarked on air that we're living in a 1939 moment.
Yeah.
And talk about that. Why do you feel like that's the case?
So that thought came to me as I was in Ukraine in February 2022, as the cruise missiles started falling, as the tanks were rolling across the border, as Russia precipitated the largest war in Europe since World War II in an attempt to absorb an entire country, the largest country in Europe, an independent country of many tens of millions of people, by force of arms. And I had covered and written about Russia and China and their attempts to undermine the US. And that was the reason I came out to talk to you guys in 2019 when I wrote The Shadow War. At that time, my thesis was, in effect, that Russia and China were fighting a war against the West and against the international system below the threshold of hot war, below the threshold of direct conflict. So as I was sitting in Ukraine and this new bloody conflict was starting, it struck me, this is different. This is an order of magnitude bigger. It's a level up, and it's a clean break with this period of 30 some odd years or so that we enjoyed of relative peace. Wasn't perfect, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that now this was very much an open conflict, and that it presents a test. I know that folks have made 1939 comparisons through the years, and even Hitler comparisons through the years with various despots as they made land grabs. And I'm not saying that Putin is the equivalent of Hitler. We have seen no Holocaust, though Russia has certainly shown no reluctance to kill civilians in large numbers. But what he shares with Hitler is a desire, an ambition, and a brazenness to redraw borders by force of arms, to just announce this country doesn't exist, and I want it, and I will go to war to get it. And that's a test, not just for Ukrainians, but for our European allies, for us, for our Asian allies, because China might view the world in a very similar way. And that if we respond, we writ large, by appeasing rather than saying this shall not stand, that we will find ourselves in a worse scenario, that this will become the norm, and so many things that we've come to rely on, we won't be able to anymore. So that's where that 1939 moment thought came to me.
Well, so and you do talk about appeasement in the book, and talk about it in some of the conversations that you have with the Prime Minister of Estonia, in particular. I mean, that's what comes to mind first, and her quoting Winston Churchill, and talking about what appeasement will lead to.
She's fond of quoting the famous crocodile quote, which I'm paraphrasing here, which Churchill said of Hitler at the time. And it's that an appeaser is one who looks at the crocodile and hopes that it will be, who feeds the crocodile rather, and hopes that it will be his last meal. In effect, saying that if you give him a little piece of Sudetenland, give him Poland, they're going to want more. And so if you give Putin a piece of Georgia, pieces of Ukraine in 2014, and more again in 2022 and beyond, that crocodile will eventually come for you. And the Estonians, I love talking to the Estonians, and I visited there for this book, and all really the leaders of the Baltic states in particular, because they are very much on the front line of this. Estonia borders Russia. It is another country whose independence Putin does not recognize. And they've only had freedom for one generation. They've only been independent since 1991. So, Kalas, many Estonians have real life experience of what it was like to live under the yoke of the USSR. This is not theoretical to them. They experienced it. They experienced the cost. They've lost relatives. They can point to their history. And they're the ones who are sounding the loudest alarm now to the US and Western European allies to say, you cannot appease this man. He will want more. And by the way, we're next. So we need your help. And Kalas, you'll read in the book, she's very strong in making that case based on history, both recent history and more distant history of Russia and how it operates.
Well, and using the phrase "we're next," I mean, as you make the case and the shadow war and talk about here, Estonians would also say, actually, we're first in the new war.
Yep.
Go back to the first cyber war in 2007.
Exactly. And that was in my last book, but I bring it up again here, 2007. By the way, Estonia was already a member of NATO at that point. They joined in 2004. So this idea that Russia would never touch a NATO country, we already have a precedent to them doing so, not a full-scale invasion, but Russia, via that cyber attack, essentially shut the country down. And the concern that the Estonians have today is that the next step would be worse. And I have a great exchange with her in there, really a telling one, where after the Ukrainian invasion, Kalas goes to the leaders of NATO allies and says, listen, your current defense plan for us doesn't work anymore. It's a tripwire plan, as it's known, the idea being that Russia invades, and then in 180 days, we're going to push them out. You're the tripwire, in effect, for the Russian invasion of NATO. And she said, listen, as we watch Ukraine being burned to the ground here, in 180 days, our tiny country, a fraction of the size of Ukraine, we'd be finished. We'd be done. You can't. That's not a sufficient defense for us. And two things struck her. Her NATO allies were surprised that was the plan. They said, what? That's the plan for protecting Estonia? And when she talked about this in public, her Estonian citizens said, excuse me, that's the plan? So that defense plan has been updated to some degree. There is now a quick reaction force designed to respond within hours to head off or defend against a Russian invasion. They have pre-positioned weapon systems, et cetera, to defend them. So it's better than it was, but it's a reminder that Europe is still adjusting to this new threat.
Well, and the just how deep a problem the tripwire concept would be was shown so dramatically in the first months of the full scale Russian invasion, with what happened with an occupation of Bucha over the course of just a month, or Kherson over the course of a few months.
Yeah, think of this film that just won the Oscar, 20 Days in Melitopol. These are cities, you just have to look up. Come on, it's so easy to find the before and after photos. These are beautiful Ukrainian cities with grand opera houses and night markets and a vibrant restaurant scene. I mean, this is for folks who haven't been to Ukraine, and Kyiv still has this, thankfully, because it has not been leveled. You can have just the most wonderful time in these places. So seeing the history, the architecture, the food, the hospitality. Russia has bulldozed that. It's bulldozed that in the cities that it occupies. And of course, committed even worse in Bucha, and that the accounts of war crimes, rape and murder of civilians it's a long list of evidence that, crimes that will be prosecuted, and some already underway in the International Criminal Court. So Estonia and our Eastern European allies look at that and say, we have to make sure that never happens. We can't respond to it as an alliance. We have to defend against it and deter it. And that's where this, again, the crocodile thinking comes in. If you give a little bit, he'll try again, and then he'll try again, and you'll be next, in effect.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned 20 days in Mariupol. We did host Mstislav Chernov here for a
Oh, great.
conversation just a few weeks ago, and so we're very very heartened to see the film
Mhm.
recognized with the Oscar.
Yeah.
Um, and and I guess coming back to appeasement as you talk about it, I myself I was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers to serve in Ukraine, and then for a
Oh,
few
wow.
years lived in the Czech Republic as well. When people think of Neville Chamberlain in Western Europe and the U.S., they think of peace in our time and him coming back.
Mhm.
Folks in Central Europe and further east, they tend to remember more the quote that I'm paraphrasing when he came back and said how incredible, how fantastic that we would be trying on gas masks and digging trenches about a conflict between people in a faraway land about whom we know nothing.
Mhm.
Of course, Prague was closer to London than Vienna at the time, right? So it wasn't that far away. But that idea of if it's far away, we can ignore it and it won't affect us.
No
Um,
question. As this to your point, again, the old saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. If you look at the America First isolationist arguments and rhetoric today, it is almost verbatim with arguments made in America in 1939 and 1940 by folks like Lindbergh and others. That's not our war. Europe is not our war. We don't want American sons and daughters dying in that war. It's not our interest. And there were even conspiracy theories at the time about how the Pearl Harbor attack was an FDR plot to get us into that war. So again, just like you have conspiracy theories today about what exactly is going on with Ukraine. Is this corruption? Is this about the oligarchs, etc.? So those arguments are the same. But imagine if those arguments had won out in 1939 or 1940, if Europe had been ceded to Nazi Germany. These are, again, I'm not saying it is absolutely equivalent in every way, but it has so many parallels to that test. And Putin, don't underestimate him and his ambitions. And remember, the other factor is that he and our other great power adversaries, Russia and China, they have nuclear weapons. They have weapons that did not exist at that time. In fact, he has more nuclear weapons than anybody in the world. And there are cyber weapons, which he's already deployed. There are cyber weapons that both Russia and China have planted in critical U.S. civilian infrastructure, so that if the war goes hot, there will be civilian consequences for it, and there will be deliberate efforts by these powers to inflict pain on you and me and things we depend on, as well as soldiers in battle.
So, since you brought up nuclear weapons, one of the I think really alarming moments that you recount in the book and have written about recently and excerpts that CNN has published, how close that the conflict in Ukraine seemed to have gotten in 2022 with the potential of Russia deploying a tactical nuclear weapon.
No
Can
question.
you talk about that?
So this was late summer, early fall 2022, the early months of the war. It was a bad time for Russian forces. They had failed in their quick blitzkrieg assault on Kyiv. And the one town city that they'd managed, the biggest prize to date of the invasion had been Kherson, but they were getting pushed out of Kherson. And Russian forces, as they were retreating, were in danger of being surrounded, many thousands of them in the south. And the U.S. calculated that based on Russian military doctrine, they have nuclear weapons, a nuclear strike much lower in an escalation ladder than we do. In fact, they have a weapon we don't have, which is a tactical or battlefield nuclear weapon. We don't have it in our arsenal, smaller than the kind that would wipe out a city, but still enormously devastating. So the U.S. was concerned that those potential losses of soldiers and territory might meet the Russian standard threshold for a nuclear attack in response, which it has in its doctrine in response to conventional threats. It's not just, straight up nuclear on nuclear. And then there were other things happening. Russian officials started speaking publicly about a putative Ukrainian plot to light off a dirty bomb, a radioactive bomb in Ukraine, which they were not. And the concern from U.S. and Western officials was that this was a ploy, this was a false flag, that Russia was going to use as justification to drop a nuke on Ukraine. I mean, that's what I'll say it in, those terms, but that's exactly what it was. You may remember in the early stages of the war, Russia had attempted a number of false flag attacks, things like terror attacks in eastern Ukraine that they were going to blame on the Ukrainians and say, oh, well, the Russian peacekeepers have to come in to calm things down. The U.S. smartly exposed those red flag plans via declassified intelligence prior to kind of deflate them. So here you had another one, and they said, wait a second, this is a problem. And the third piece was that the U.S. got intelligence of Russian commanders discussing a tactical nuclear strike. That collection of indicators led to, as you mentioned, senior U.S. officials telling me that they began making rigorous plans for this possibility, including the possibility of U.S. military reactions, the whole host of things. What would we do, in effect? And in addition to that, they went on a full court press internationally to try to head this off. And that included direct contacts between U.S. and their Russian counterparts. The CIA director, Bill Burns, who I interviewed for the book, he went to meet his counterpart, Sergei Naryshkin, who is a very difficult guy, face-to-face in Turkey, to say, we know what you seem to be up to. What are your intentions here? General Mark Milley, who I interviewed for the book, spoke to his counterpart. Lloyd Austin spoke to his counterpart, moving through the line to say, this cannot happen. Most interestingly, it wasn't just U.S. to Russia. The U.S. Enlisted the help of non-allies, India and China, to deliver the same message, because they calculated India and China did not want a nuclear war in Ukraine either. And they say to me, including Secretary Blinken, that intervention, they believe, helped head this off. Threat has not entirely disappeared. You may have heard Vladimir Putin recently raising the nuclear specter again. But at the time, it reached a peak of tremendous seriousness. And I just don't think any of us were aware at the time of how close we came.
So what to kind of use a counter argument that Ukrainians have brought up again and again. They'll say, you people in the West, you're always scared, right? Putin always, threatens to use nuclear weapons. We're not scared, so you don't need to be scared.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's not just Ukrainians. The Estonian prime minister, for instance, says you have to be careful not to exaggerate the nuclear threat or to listen too much to the nuclear saber rattling, because Russia calculates that anytime they sort of pull out that nuclear card, that the West is like, oh, well, we better not send them any more weapons. Or if we do, they got to be smaller weapons, shorter range, and we don't want to upset them. And, let's pull back a little bit. I think it's possible that both can be true, right? That you don't want to be, you sort of don't want to take yourself out of it and basically preemptively neuter yourself in terms of how you're responding. But on the flip side, at this moment in late 2022, they were convinced that it was serious and calculated the best outcome was to deter and not get into a point where, the strike happens and you're running through your military operations, which included the possibility of U.S. forces striking Russian forces directly, which of course would have escalated the conflict into a whole new sphere.
Well, and one of the things that Ukrainians talked about very much at the beginning of the full-scale invasion was going back to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, yes, when they gave up their own nuclear weapons. I mean, I remember, when I was working for the embassy in Kyiv, going to visit a missile silo in Khmelnytsky that was being destroyed, and sunflowers would be planted, and this was one of these wonderful moments of the Cold War, right? Reducing the danger of nuclear weapons around the world.
It's such a shame, right? Because we, and a number of folks I speak to for the book, including Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, they lament, right, that lost moment, because we all remember the hope of the 90s when things like that were happening, the nukes out of Ukraine. There were a whole host of military not cooperation, but at least communication. There were some joint exercises. I spoke to some European commanders, U.S. commanders who have been in the military for some time, and they lived through the Cold War period, that rapprochement and now back to where we are again, and just seeing it come full circle. And they're sad about it, right? They don't cheer this return of that great power dynamic, but the fact is it's happening. And the other piece of that for Ukraine is that it's one reason among many. They say, how can you expect us to make a deal with Russia? Every deal we've made with Russia, they've broken, including the Budapest Memorandum. Or if you look at the various Minsk agreements that, were supposedly going to solve the war in Ukraine, they say Russia signs on the dotted line and then they roll the tanks across the border the next day. So the make a deal camp has a very skeptical audience among many in Ukraine, because they just say our experience gives us no confidence.
So we've been talking a great deal about Ukraine and the full-scale Russian invasion. Certainly a big part of your book, and both in the Shadow War and in the Return of Great Powers, is the role of China and the potential for conflict over Taiwan. Can
Yes.
talk about that, and obviously there's a connection between what happens or doesn't happen in Ukraine and what might or might not happen with Taiwan.
There is. I went to Taiwan to research the book, and I spent time not just with Taiwanese political leaders, but also military commanders. I went to the Penghu Islands, which is a small archipelago off the west coast of Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait, closer to China. And this is where they have many of their Air Force, naval, and ground bases that would be the front line, the first line of defense against a potential Chinese invasion. And I saw them carrying out very serious exercises, which they do every day. I saw them scrambling jets to respond to Chinese jets, mainland Chinese jets that were coming into their airspace. Not a single person I met there doesn't believe, or I should say, every person I met there believes that China is watching what happens in Ukraine as a lesson for itself as relates to Taiwan, for two reasons. One, what they can learn militarily about how a David battles a Goliath in the case of an invasion, but two, how the world will react. Will they, in effect, let Russia get away with it, which would then, the Taiwanese believe, teach or indicate to Xi Jinping that he could get away with taking Taiwan, and that the consequences might be some consequences in the short term, but eventually the West will run out of patience and the cost will be too high, and they'll say, okay, do we really care about Taiwan that much? I mean, this is all it's happening before our eyes in the U.S. regarding Ukraine, right? When I was in Ukraine 2 years ago, that's all it was. A little over 2 years ago, I was struck by how bipartisan the support for Ukraine was, and I had people have different views of CNN politically in this country, but Republicans and Democrats, lawmakers on the Hill, they would say, you guys did such great work there at suffering of the Ukrainian people across the board. And you heard that in the public comments too. That has changed. A big portion of that is Donald Trump's position on it, but others, it's a exhaustion. It's the effect of misinformation. So China looks at all of that and says, maybe we can get away with Taiwan.
So let me posit this and see if you say this is a fair description of what you're assessing, that if Russia fails in Ukraine, that still might not deter China from eventually trying to take Taiwan. But if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, that would certainly encourage China from to take Taiwan.
That's the
read. You even talk about. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say that's the read I heard consistently, but please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, there's even a date that some of the folks that you talk to say that Xi Jinping has given by 2027. This is supposed to happen.
Yeah, well, at least have the forces ready. He wants their forces ready for the plan, and there's been some discussion. And again, these are intel assessments, so you're not certain, but discussion of him accelerating that plan, or at least accelerating the capability. Now, there are you speak to some U.S. officials who believe that because Russia was not able to succeed in its blitzkrieg, I'm going to take Kyiv in 72 hours plan, and we are more than 2 years in, and the losses to Russia have been significant, that provides some deterrent factor, because China might calculate, okay, well, maybe it's not that easy. We might eventually win, but there'd be a lot of pain in the meantime. And Taiwan has the added challenge that it's an island, right? It's just harder. All military historians will tell you, a amphibious landing is the hardest. It's the hardest invasion to do, going back to Greek times, right? And through D-Day, it's just really hard to do. And Taiwan has been defending itself to make the costs higher, to raise the costs for China. So there are a lot of inputs to that calculus. But there's a saying they like to say, Mark Milley likes to say this in the Pentagon, that not today, in effect, that they want Xi Jinping to wake up every day and say, well, stars aren't aligned today. And then the next day, make the same judgment, kind of constantly push out that horizon so that hopefully it never happens. But to your point, China certainly wants to be ready. And I talk a lot about in the book about how Xi Jinping and Putin have very similar views of each situation, Ukraine and Taiwan. They both look at them as historical wrongs, that they should never have been separated from Mother Russia or mainland China. They have some chip on their shoulder for fallen empires. Putin's fallen empire is the USSR, only 30 some odd years ago or so. Xi Jinping's fallen empire goes back further to the Opium Wars, mid-19th centuries, et cetera. But still, this sense that we were wronged, we were toppled off our pedestal, and we're going to climb back up there to our rightful place, alongside or above the U.S. Those forces aren't changing regardless of how long an invasion would take. And both men, it seems, put as central to the success of their leadership successfully carrying this out. Putin wants to gain back the near abroad of Russia, and Xi Jinping wants to gain back Taiwan, and that they see that as historically defining for them. So that stuff doesn't disappear. That stuff is locked in.
Well, and you also write about and have written about a couple of things that come to mind as you were saying that. One, kind of their attitudes toward a rules-based international order, and two, a U.S. tendency to mirror.
Yes.
When it comes to international relations.
First of all, I want to thank you because when you held up your book there, you have all your Post-it notes. I always love when I do an interview with someone who really read and took notes on the book, which I appreciate. It's the finest compliment you can give to an author. So thank you. Back to your question. It's, these are big judgments to make over time, and the key from the U.S. perspective is, take me back to your question again. I want to make sure I answer correctly.
Kind of, yeah, sort of one kind of similar attitudes toward a rules-based international order.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, fair enough.
The first time.
So they both want to, they both calculate that the U.S.-led rules-based international order that we hear U.S. leaders, European leaders talk about in glowing terms were nice for you guys, but not for us. They were in your interest. They were designed to help you and kind of keep us down. I mean, that's the fact of the matter is that, certainly for China, perhaps less so for Russia because its economy is more isolated, but that system has greatly benefited China's economic rise. It certainly gave Russia a vibrant market for its energy in Europe, now cut off. Russia has had to go to entirely new customers for its oil and gas. No more Germany, no more Europe. So whatever their view of the system, they benefited from that system. And you and I did. It makes things cheaper if you can safely, sail your container ship through the Asian shipping lanes, or you can do business and open businesses up safely in Eastern Europe, including in Estonia, that kind of thing. And if we can send our kids to semesters abroad there, there are a whole host of benefits that come from this, and that Russian and Chinese parents can do as well. But still, fundamentally, they look at it as strategically a negative for them. And the read is that each has a different intention. In Bill Burns, the CIA director's words, Putin is the man who wants to bring the temple down. He wants to destroy the system, will benefit from its dissolution and from chaos. China likes having a system, and our economies are far more intertwined, and therefore our economic health is far more intertwined. China doesn't want no system, but it wants a system with it at the center, if not at the top. And a system that doesn't necessarily mind things like stealing trade secrets wholesale, which it does, and that doesn't stand in the way of China's rightful territorial claims in Hong Kong and Taiwan, et cetera, which is, of course, a fundamental problem with the way we view the system. But still, the difference being that Russia, happy to burn it down, China wants to replace it to some degree, or at least modify it.
So since you brought up chaos, and you've also brought up Hitler and the dissolution of bipartisan support for Ukraine, one of the other alarming revelations in the book, you talk about a presidential candidate who has spoken glowingly of Adolf Hitler.
It's
talk about that.
And this comes from John Kelly, who was Trump's chief of staff, of course, and then he was also DHS secretary. So he spoke to Trump frequently, traveled with Trump, discussed issues of national import and enormous national security issues with him. So this comes from his direct interactions with the president. And he said that Trump repeatedly praised Adolf Hitler. He said the words came out of his mouth, "Hitler did some good things," to which Kelly said he would say, "Excuse me, what good things?" And Trump said, "Well, he rebuilt the economy after World War I." And Kelly said, "Sure, but then use that economy to wage war on Europe and our allies. And not to mention, carry out the Holocaust." And he says in so many words, "I can't believe that he forgot the Holocaust," or the 400,000 US GIs that died in the European theater fighting Germany, fighting Nazi Germany. But Trump persisted. And Trump also would say to Kelly that Hitler's generals were more loyal to him than you are. Why aren't you generals loyal to me? This classic Trump test of, if you're not serving me, then you're no good to me, in effect. And Kelly again would have to correct Trump's history on that, beyond the obvious idiocy, sorry for the word, but I think it's pretty obvious idiocy of praising the loyalty of generals to the man who carried out the Holocaust. He would have to remind Trump to say, well, actually, Hitler's generals tried to take him out. They tried to assassinate him multiple times, sir. You've got the history wrong. But again, with Trump, I mean, his impression of him is that you can't convince him if he believes he knows better than you. And this extended beyond Hitler to other despots. He spoke glowingly, both in private and in public, as we've heard, of Vladimir Putin, of Xi Jinping, of Kim Jong-un. And all of them, not only would he say, these are good guys, or an okay guy, as Kelly would tell it, but he imagined that just by force of personality, he could negotiate with them, make a deal, right? A deal over Ukraine, a deal over Taiwan, a deal over you name it, which at the core of that is a fundamental misunderstanding, Trump's misunderstanding of what these countries are about, because they want to hurt the U.S., they want to weaken the U.S. They may not want to go to war with the U.S. directly, but they don't have our best interests at heart, right? And no matter how charming or good a negotiator he imagines himself to be, his advisors constantly say the strategic issues of Russia and China are not changing. They want to bring down or change the system. They want to weaken the U.S., but Trump doesn't see that, and he doesn't see that not just with Hitler, but with Xi and today's despots.
Well, since you mentioned that, right, he just hosted Viktor Orban from Hungary.
And he said, and Viktor Orban said, and I would say, and I say this in the book, listen to what they say. Orban said Trump will not give another penny to Ukraine if he's reelected. And that's exactly what John Bolton, who is Trump's national security advisor, John Kelly, and others said, that if Trump's reelected, U.S. support for Ukraine ends. And it's interesting, too, because oftentimes Trump imagines things that don't exist. When he was praising Orban down at Mar-a-Lago, he said, Orban, he gets things done. Everybody listens to him. He's a powerful leader. When in fact, just 2 weeks ago, Europe stuffed Orban because he was opposing European aid to Ukraine. And they played hardball with him. And they basically said, we're going to, if not destroy your economy, we're going to punish your economy if you don't come on board. And he did. He broke. So, these images of strength are often exaggerated.
So one of the members of our audience ask about another particular despot. Wondering if you can talk about North Korea and particular dangers and concerns, whether it's in connection to China or Trump or.
Well, one thing I talk about in the book is that you have this sort of, I don't call it this and hasn't been called it yet, but new axis of evil. But you have certainly a cooperation between Russia and China. They call it their no limits partnership. They announced that, in fact, just a few weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and have held to it. With the addition of middle powers that have made their own friendships, alliances with Russia and China, and that led by Iran and North Korea. And you're seeing that with both Iran and North Korea arming Russia in Ukraine. North Korea is sending artillery shells, many thousands of them, and Iran has been sending these Shahad drones, which have had just devastating effect, particularly on civilian targets in Ukraine. So you have this this meeting of the minds among these despots, and that includes North Korea. And North Korea, I mean, even recently, he's been rattling his own saber about attacking South Korea, which has caused a lot of concern there, and should cause a lot of concern because that's another alliance that Trump's former advisors say Trump is likely to weaken if he were to be reelected. He talked about this during his first term, taking U.S. troops or some U.S. troops off the peninsula, and that would be consequential for South Korea because those are essential to its defense. And of course, South Korea is, one of America's oldest allies, right? It's we went to war in 1951 to help protect them from North Korea. So these are consequential things. Now, I went on all three of Trump's face-to-face summits with Kim in Singapore, Hanoi. Where was the other one? He had another one. Anyway, I went to all three of them. You'll remember during his last presidency where he imagined that, again, just by force of personality, I can make a deal with North Korea and nuclear weapons, and it didn't go anywhere. And in fact, North Korea expanded its nuclear program while Trump was president and expanded its missile program. So, whatever your politics, just look at the track record. And while Trump imagines himself as the man who can fundamentally change these adversaries, including North Korea and Kim Jong-un, the track record doesn't show it.
So let's talk a little bit about some other recent events. I mean, we've talked about Estonia. NATO welcomed a new member just in the past week. A blue and yellow flag for Sweden was raised in Brussels. And can you talk about that and the NATO and the argument that it was the expansion of NATO that made Putin have to attack Ukraine?
So first, let's talk about NATO's expansion, because it's, of course, two countries, Finland and Sweden, that have joined since the invasion, and they would not have joined without the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And their change, both countries that have deeply protected their independence and relative neutrality for many decades, made a fundamental decision to change that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Finland, which has fought a war against Russia in the 1940s, a war of independence, but since then has made itself sort of an intermediary between the West and Russia and kept deep economic ties and face-to-face meetings between their president and Putin, et cetera. But after that invasion, they said, this doesn't work anymore. In effect, one, that policy of engagement is not working. Two, we need allies to help defend ourselves against the possibility of a Russian invasion. So we are now in the alliance, and that lengthens the frontier between NATO and Russia by about 800 miles with that Finnish border there, and also adds to NATO a highly capable military. And then you have Sweden as well, which deliberately was not in NATO, but calculated now we need to be. And that's an indicator of how seriously they're taking the Russia threat. And they know they're close to it. They're closer than we are. And two, it's an example of what was often cited to me by officials I interviewed for this book, that it shows that Ukraine is already a strategic failure for Russia. One, it didn't get what it wanted, a quick invasion and absorption of the country, but it has expanded NATO. It said, its demand on the eve of invasion was no more members of NATO, and look what happened. actually NATO has grown. So, on many fronts, this is one thing that a lot of folks I spoke to about for this book, and we talked about a little bit on the nuclear front, is don't imagine that Russia is 10 feet tall. It has weaknesses. And it certainly has a major strategic loss from the invasion, and that is the expansion of NATO.
So coming back to Finland, one of the wonderful quotes you have early on in the book is from the ambassador to the U.S.,
Yeah.
right? Historically, if a great power with which you have a common border tries to block you and put you in a cage, then it's not a good idea to stay in the cage. At least you have to try to make sure that nobody locks the cage.
Yes. It's and it shows exactly their thinking. When Russia said to them, "You're not going to NATO," over our dead body, in effect, they said, "Oh, first of all, that's our choice. Second of all, if my neighbor says that probably means I'm in trouble. I need to be even more so." So again, it's a fundamental misreading of Finland by Putin, that he thought he could quash them, just as Putin and his generals and intel officers had a fundamental reading of Ukraine, because part of their calculation was that Ukraine's going to fold, and Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country, who Russia claims as ethnic Russians, although it's a dodgy claim to some degree, that they're going to welcome us. And no, they didn't. Some small did, but a lot have been turned the other way. So, Russia is capable of its own very deep and damaging miscalculations.
Well, on the point of ethnic Russians, I think when Mstislav Chernov, talks about the film 20 Days in Mariupol, one of the things he points out is like everyone in the film in Mariupol, there's almost everyone is speaking Russian, right? The Russians are not liberating them, they're killing them. Yeah.
It's a great point. And it's why, like, when you asked the question about whether NATO expansion really sparked this war, which is a point, the Tucker Carlsons of the world make. I always say, the first thing I say in response to that is ask the Ukrainians or the Estonians or the Finnish, why do they choose to join NATO? We're not forcing them. Why do they choose? They choose, and I have asked them, because the Estonians and the Finnish and others, the Polish, made the calculation that we're safer in NATO, safer specifically from Russian expansion. And they're the ones who are sounding the alarm loudest. And sometimes you'll hear complaints. You hear it from Kaja Kallas talking about some of her Western-facing, not all of them, but some of the Western-facing NATO allies who say, you guys are exaggerating. She says, no, we're not. And trust me, we know better. We know better. So that's one thing. They want to be in NATO, just as Ukraine wants to be in the EU and NATO, because they look at the system, the economy, the openness, and say that's a better future, present and future for us than what Russia is offering. Now, can you argue that Russia, the other argument is then, okay, set aside what those countries want. Let's just talk about our own interests for a moment. I'd argue what the countries want is the primary interest, but let's talk about our own interests. Had we not welcomed them into NATO, would there have been no war? Russia goes after countries outside of NATO as well, and arguably more aggressively in some instances. You've got Moldova right now and Transnistria. Same playbook, right? Oh, the ethnic Russians, the people of Transnistria are begging for us to come here, and we have to act. You could argue they're more aggressive with the non-NATO members than the NATO members, and the NATO members say, which side of that line do I want to be on? On which side of that dividing line am I safer?
It's been a long time since I was in Transnistria, but when I was there, it struck me as a combination between a Soviet museum and a mafia-run enclave. It's kind of fascinating. And of course, there were Russian officers who went from there to the Donbass when the playbook was then being executed there in 2014.
I believe it.
One of the members of the audience asked a question about the recent interview with Pope Francis, where he talks about the courage of raising the white flag. Certainly across Ukraine, there's been a very visceral reaction against that. Wondering what your thoughts are.
I read those. I'm a Catholic, but born and raised. 12 years of Catholic school, and by the Jesuits, no less. And of course, Pope Francis is a Jesuit. So I've always liked it. And I liked his approach just personally to what are the core beliefs of Catholicism, service. And he's relaxed a lot of the more draconian rules, although God knows the church has a long way to go on many things. But when I saw those comments, I was alarmed, right? I mean, raise the white flag. I mean, I tweeted about this. I would say, what is he saying in effect? Is he saying, because the Catholic Church, has this just war theory, and he has previously written about modifying that to some degree, basically questioning, do we call too many wars just in effect, and so he's been trying to move that standard to some degree. And, my question for him would be, how far are you saying if an invasion works, then there is no just war? Because it seems to be what you're saying here, that they should raise the white flag because they're losing. Now, the Vatican has tried to push back on the initial comments, saying that, well, he was saying the first step has to be Russia stopping offensive operations. But it's hard not to read those comments to be also communicating that Ukraine's going to have to give something up here. Now, on that point, he's not alone, because not so much in public, but in private, you hear in Europe, you hear here in the US that, well, Ukraine's really fighting for negotiating position right now, and that at some point they're going to have to draw a line and live with it. In fact, in the book, General Mark Milley, he's no longer the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but when I was speaking to him, he said in so many words, Ukraine is not likely to be in NATO, that you have to find some agreement that meets Ukraine's security desire for security guarantees and Russia's desire for some sort of degree guarantee that NATO is not going to attack them. Whether you think that's substantial or not, that may be what you need to do. And a Ukraine in NATO doesn't meet that standard because, you got Crimea there, which Russia sees as strategically central, home of their Black Sea fleet, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, it was notable to me to hear Milley saying out loud what many say in private, and that is not inconsistent with what Pope Francis is saying here, that, okay, Russia stopped, but Ukraine's also going to have to stop at some point. We got to work this out. It wouldn't be the first time you ended a war with land concessions. But the other point I would make about that, and someone in Ukraine made this point to me very smartly, which I think is true, that we talk about political pressures here over Ukraine. Trump making angry tweets to Republicans who support Ukraine aid, or maybe you lose a congressional seat because the Republican Party takes away their support, or whatever the political calculations are. Zelensky's political calculation, the pressure on him is tens of thousands of Ukrainian mothers who lost their sons and daughters in combat. So he would have to go to them and say, what they were fighting for there, we're going to have to give it up. And that's one difficult thing to do. And there are even some who say he couldn't survive that politically. So that's a pretty strong political force to imagine, to push up against.
So one of the things that you address on kind of a big scale as you're wrapping up the book, this is not just what is happening is not just a return to a new Cold War. Mm-hmm. There's something different going on.
It is. It's interesting. I was talking to another interviewer about this earlier today, that there are some who say we're in a new Cold War. And he said, your argument seems to be it's not a new Cold War, that it's a return to even a prior period of true great power standoff. And I believe there are Cold War elements to it, but I do think it's fundamentally more dangerous for a number of reasons. One, it's tripolar now because you have not just one great power adversary in Russia, but another in China, and they're working together. And if you just look at the map divided along those lines, I try to draw that visually for people in the book, but it's almost like a V, right? You have these two iron curtains now, one cutting through Europe this way, all the way up to Finland now, and the other cutting through Asia this way, South China Sea, Taiwan. Imagine that. It's a dangerous world, right? With those kinds of dividing lines, and those dividing lines getting increasingly militarized. So that's one factor that makes it more difficult and more dangerous. You have whole categories of weapons that you didn't have in the last Cold War. Nuclear, but three countries, and well, actually more countries with it now when you throw in the North Koreans and so on. Iran developing its own program, plus whole categories: cyber weapons, weaponization of space, Russia talking about putting a nuke in space, and weapons systems that there are no treaties to control. The nuclear treaties with Russia are declining. They have pulled out of them. We've pulled out of some of them, so that's less regulated. There are no treaties for cyber weapons. There are no real treaties for the weaponization of space that seem to be holding right now. So there are fewer guardrails, and Bill Burns talks about this a lot in the book, how he's concerned about the dissolution of those guardrails that keep you from going into a hot conflict. So that makes it different from the last Cold War. And there were wars, there were proxy wars in the last Cold War. Some that were and some that we misread as proxy wars, including Vietnam, right? When you go back to the reading of that. This one, though, could very well, I think you can make a very good case that Ukraine is already a proxy war, right? Russia's there, we are arming Ukraine. Without our arming them, Ukraine would be in serious trouble. Taiwan would be different and more than a Cold War, because you have a sitting US president that has now committed the US to military action to defend it. Strategic ambiguity as regards Taiwan. If it's not dead, it's weakened now. The U.S. has committed itself to military conflict there. So to me, and there's just a brazenness, right, about the exercises of this great power conflict. So to me, it's hotter than the old Cold War, and that's concerning. As I said, I think I said to you earlier, I got 13-year-old and a 15-year-old son. I don't want them. They're a few years away from draft age. I don't want a world where we go to war. I am far from a warmonger. I want peace, and that's why I spent the last chapter of the book looking at paths to peace, by talking to folks involved for their recommendations.
Well, kind of with that in mind, and thinking of your children too. So what concerns you most as as we get deeper into this election year, and are looking at the next couple of years?
Momentum towards war scares me, right? Because momentum is a powerful force. I talk in the book about how, again, using history as our guide, that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so the closest that the U.S. and Soviet Union came to war, that Kennedy deliberately had his cabinet read The Guns of August, which had just come out earlier that year in 1962, Barbara Tuchman's story of how we fell into World War I. And he even had a great quote where he said, I don't want to be in a situation where anybody could write a book called The Missiles of 1962, right? He didn't want to have that cautionary tale written someday about his decisions or Soviet decisions in the time. So I think we need to be conscious of history, that sometimes you can end up in a war you don't want. The good news is that the confident read of U.S. and intelligence and Western intelligence is that neither Russia nor China want to go to war with the U.S. They want to damage us and weaken us and bring down systems we depend on, but they don't want to get into a shooting war with us. The trouble is, and Bill Burns talked about this, that we're playing without a net, in his words, on so many of these conflicts. We don't have the same treaties. We don't have the same communications channels. And he talks about how a small incident can easily escalate. One aircraft clips the wing of another aircraft, right, in one of these close encounters in the sky, or one ship clips another ship, or a cyber attack goes too far and turns off the lights in Washington, right? And then we react and the other side reacts, and you end up off to the races, as Bill Burns says. That's what concerns me, and that we need, part of the solution is recognizing the seriousness of the threat, the various flashpoints as a first step, and then finding ways to avoid conflict in those places. And in some places that's negotiation, some places it's treaties, and some places it is making and setting and communicating clear red lines. Among them, you can't just redraw maps by force. We're not going to stand for that.
So you mentioned kind of one plane clipping another's wing. You actually recount one of the incidents, a U.S. intelligence plane, right,
Yep.
being nicked by a Chinese fighter. That's one of the incidents that you.
2001, April 2001, over Hainan Island. You may remember that. And imagine if that happened today. That's 23 years ago. You know, the EP-3 at the time, clipped by a Chinese fighter jet, got too close. Chinese pilot dies. That plane goes down. So there's already someone dead. The U.S. plane has to land on Hainan. Those airmen and women, I believe, are held for a week and a half. Big standoff. I mean, if you imagine if that have that today with a far more capable China and the relations arguably colder. Though, you know, we're just one bad turn of the yoke right away from an incident like that. One updraft, right, that drives one plane into the other. One Russian missile from Ukraine that lands in Poland. You know, it's not. We have so many of the conditions in place to allow for something like that to happen, and that's concerning.
Well, and that's you describe in the book the time that you spent with a NATO force in the Baltic, and Russian jets coming in repeatedly.
Yep, went on a very high readiness joint task force in the Baltic. This is one of the demonstrations of how seriously NATO is taking the Russia threat, because they didn't used to. I mean, they did patrols around up there, but you know, the size of the patrols, these task forces has doubled. The frequency and their footing. They are very high readiness. They are on the lookout. And while we were there, Russian ships came close, Russian aircraft. Sometimes they fly right over the deck. I was talking to a pilot. I mean, we saw them, you know, at a distance, which is, you know, given the speeds they travel, is still pretty dangerous. But he was just one of the pilots was describing. He was on a ship last year, and the Russian pilot came in inverted over the deck. You know, the sort of a Top Gun kind of "hello, I'm watching you" kind of thing. But those things can be easily misread. There was a close call in the East China Sea when a Chinese ship cut off a U.S. destroyer. You might remember that. Those are dangerous, and they've increased in frequency and brazenness. And as the German commander of the task force told me, he said, in Russia or China, that doesn't happen by accident. Those pilots, they don't act independently. They have to have the okay from the higher up. So it's deliberate.
So, talking about NATO, you talked to some of the former members of the Trump administration who were very clear on what would happen to U.S. involvement in NATO in a second Trump administration.
Out of NATO. Bolton and Kelly describe a moment in 2018 at the NATO summit where Trump nearly, or at least tried to take the U.S. out of NATO. And they believe that in a second term, he would finish the job. Now, as you know, you probably read, Congress passed legislation that would require congressional approval to leave the treaty. But let's be frank, a commander-in-chief has the power to wage war in this country. And if you have a commander-in-chief who will not send troops to defend a NATO ally that's been attacked, it won't happen. And Trump, you'll remember a couple of weeks ago, said, you know, Russia, do whatever the hell you want to countries who don't pay their 2%. But he's also, in other circumstances, questioned whether it would be in the U.S. interest to go to war over the Baltics and other places, as have a lot of conservative commentators. And then with regards to Taiwan, John Bolton tells me a story in the book about how Trump in the Oval Office would take out a Sharpie. He likes Sharpies, as you know, and point to the tip of the Sharpie and say, see that? That's Taiwan. See this resolute desk? That is China, to make the point that Taiwan doesn't have a chance against China, and therefore we have no business trying to defend them. Worrisome if you're in Taiwan. That's why this election, again, whatever your politics are, your view of the world, it is an enormous choice for American voters about America's position in the world. Because this next president wouldn't just sort of turn the ship a little bit to the left or the right. He would turn it 180 degrees in the opposite direction with huge consequences for us, for our allies, for how we live in this world. You know, it's no small thing, not just a nuance.
So one of the members of the audience has kind of a more personal question for you. What's both the most challenging part of your job and what's the most rewarding?
Okay, so I'll start with rewarding. I've been traveling and reporting from around the world and living in places around the world since I left college. And I just enjoy it. You know, when I got out of college, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I knew I was interested in media and reporting, but I got a Fulbright fellowship, and I thought about the Peace Corps actually, but I got a Fulbright fellowship and went to China, and it opened up my world, and I stayed there for a number of years, and I think that you know, just got in my blood. I enjoyed the issues and covering events as they played out before my eyes, and then trying to relate that back home in ways that made sense. And then over time, what I've tried to do is connect the dots for these places, not just cover the news stories individually, but connect them into a bigger picture, like I tried to do with this book or with the Shadow War. You know, in both cases, I've been covering Russia, China, Taiwan, Ukraine for years, and you know the changes struck me. You know, in 2019, it was like, wait a second, there's a plan here that Russia and China have. We have to be aware of it. And now with this book, wait a second, our world has changed fundamentally, and we have to be prepared for that. So that's what I enjoy. I enjoy doing that, and I enjoy going to the places. I enjoy eating the food and talking to the people and just sitting on the beaches or climbing the mountains, whatever it is in every place, that I still to this day truly enjoy it. What's most challenging, I will say, today in this country is that our information bubbles have become so impregnable that you know, I always thought part of my job is just to, you know, without prejudice, try to tell folks what's happening at home and abroad. I worry over time that whatever I report will not penetrate this bubble over here that has its own view of everything, whether it's Putin or Russia or Ukraine or China. And I suppose we're all guilty of this, right? That we retreat further in that bubbles, both socially in terms of what we read and so on. And when those bubbles don't meet, then we have two different realities on so many things. We've already seen it with something like the 2020 election, where a significant portion of this country buys the lie the election was stolen. And I can't, you know, I could, you know, shoot fireworks in the air, you know, endlessly and not penetrate that bubble. And that worries me, you know, on a whole host of these things. I mean, there are times that you can get across, like I said, the early days of the Ukraine war, I felt like and there was data that showed that the world was watching, right? October 7th, you know, going to Israel for those attacks. I do believe that penetrated the bubbles, but it's getting harder. And that's the toughest part of my job.
All right. Well, so I have to say on the Fulbright, having directed the Fulbright program in Ukraine, I'm absolutely a fan of anyone who would do that. Big believer in the international exchanges.
Yes, 100%.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I would like to say give our thanks to Jim Sciutto, author of The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. And we encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Jim's new book at your local bookstore. And if you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Stephen Sound. Thank you and take care.
Thanks, everybody.